I moved to the small riverside town looking for peace. My life had become chaotic, noisy, and I needed a change. The people there were kind, although they kept to themselves. The houses were old, some abandoned, and the river, always there, winding its way past the town, held a certain beauty. But it wasn't long before I noticed something strange about that place. It started with a sound. Late at night, when the streets were empty, I would hear something coming from the river. Faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but as I lay awake in bed, straining to hear it, I realized it was crying. A woman's sobs. At first, I dismissed it as someone walking near the river, maybe someone mourning. The town had an air of sadness, and I thought it was just part of life there. But the crying, it grew more frequent. Every night, just past midnight, the same distant sobbing, barely audible, but always there. I asked around, but the locals didn't talk about it. They would shrug, give me a sideways glance, and change the subject. It wasn't until I spoke to an older man who had lived there his entire life that I got some answers. He leaned in close, his voice low. "That's La Llorona," he said. "The weeping woman." I had heard stories, of course. Growing up, I knew the legend, the woman who had drowned her children in a fit of rage and now wandered the rivers crying for them, seeking to take others to the depths. But I had always thought it was just a tale to scare children. Nothing more. The old man's eyes were serious, though. "It's no story here. She haunts the river. Anyone who hears her cries is marked." "Marked?" I asked, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. "She'll come for you," he said. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but once you hear her, she's not far behind. Don't go near the river at night." I didn't believe him, not really. How could I? It was just a ghost story, a superstition. But something in his voice lingered with me. That night, I stayed awake, listening. The sobbing came again, clearer this time, and louder. I couldn't help it. I had to know. I left my house, quietly slipping out the door, and walked toward the river. The night was cold, and the mist hung low over the ground, swirling around my feet as I moved closer to the sound. There, by the water's edge, I saw a figure. A woman, dressed in white, her long hair covering her face. She was bent over, as if she were searching for something in the water, her hands trailing in the dark current. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to turn back, to run, but I couldn't move. It was as if I were frozen in place, compelled to keep watching. Her sobs grew louder, echoing in the night, and then she stopped. Slowly, she began to stand. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and then she turned. Her face, God, her face, it wasn't human. It was twisted, bloated, the skin pulled tight over her skull, her eyes hollow and black. And yet, she still cried, her mouth open in a soundless scream. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The figure stepped toward me, her hands reaching out, fingers clawed and dripping with water. I ran. I don't even remember how I made it back to my house, but I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart racing. I could still hear her sobbing outside. For the rest of the night, I sat by the window watching. The sobbing eventually faded, but I knew she was still there. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed a bag, went to my car, but the engine wouldn't start. Every time I tried, it sputtered and died. It was as if something didn't want me to leave. I went back to the old man, demanding answers. "You've seen her now," he said quietly. "It's too late. She's claimed you." I couldn't accept it. Claimed? No. There had to be a way out. There had to be something I could do. But the old man just shook his head. "She's been here longer than any of us," he said. "And those she marks don't last long." The words haunted me as much as her cries. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window, waiting, listening. For hours, there was nothing. Just the wind outside and the occasional rustle of the trees. But just past midnight, the sobbing began again. This time it was closer. I could hear it right outside my door, like she was just waiting for me to come out. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The sobbing grew louder, almost desperate, as if she were begging me to help her. I wanted to move, to run, but I was frozen in place. And then there was a knock. It was soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. Just 3 slow knocks. My skin prickled with fear, and I felt like the air around me had thickened, pressing down on me. I knew who it was. I knew what was waiting for me on the other side of that door. I backed away as far as I could, pressing myself against the wall. The knocking stopped, but the sobbing continued. I couldn't take it anymore. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, like it was part of me now. The next few days were a blur. I barely ate. I barely slept. Every night she came back, her cries louder, more insistent. I thought I was losing my mind. And then, the whispers started. They came from the river. I couldn't understand the words at first, but the longer I listened, the clearer they became. "Come to me," they said. "Come to the water." I didn't want to. I fought against it with everything I had, but each night the pull grew stronger. It was like an invisible rope was tied around my chest, dragging me toward the riverbank. On the fifth night, I couldn't resist any longer. The whispers filled my mind, drowning out everything else. I got up, barely aware of what I was doing, and walked out of the house. The town was dead silent. No one was out. No one would help me. The river shimmered under the moonlight as I approached, its surface calm, almost inviting. The figure of the woman stood there, waiting for me, just as before. But this time, she didn't turn away. She didn't sob. She just stood, her dark eyes locked on mine, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. I stopped a few feet away from her, my legs shaking, my breath shallow. Every instinct told me to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. Her voice echoed in my head. "Come closer," she whispered. "Look into the water." I didn't want to, but my body was no longer mine to control. I stepped forward, the ground soft and wet beneath my feet. I was standing at the very edge now, my toes sinking into the cold mud. And then I saw them. Faces, beneath the surface of the water. Children's faces, pale and ghostly, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. They were reaching up toward me, their hands grasping at the air. I stumbled back, my heart racing. But the woman, La Llorona, moved closer, her fingers brushing against my arm. Her touch was like ice, seeping into my skin, freezing my blood. "They were mine," she said, her voice hollow. "I lost them, and now you will join them." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt heavy, like something was pulling me down, dragging me toward the water. The faces in the river grew clearer, their eyes filled with desperation. "No," I managed to choke out, fighting against the force that was pulling me. But it was no use. I was slipping, falling toward the edge, my feet sinking deeper into the mud. Just as I was about to plunge into the icy depths, I heard a voice. A different voice, a man's voice, calling my name. It was the old man, standing at the top of the hill, a lantern in his hand. "La Llorona!" he shouted. "Leave him be!" The woman turned, her eyes narrowing as she hissed at him, her face contorting into a mask of rage. For a moment, the force pulling me lessened, and I managed to break free, scrambling up the riverbank. The old man grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "Come on," he said. "We don't have much time." We ran, the cries of La Llorona echoing behind us, growing more distant with each step. When we reached the town, he turned to me, his face grave. "She's not done with you," he said, "but you've bought yourself a little more time." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, La Llorona, her twisted face, her eyes filled with rage and sorrow. The old man's words echoed in my mind. "She's not done with you." I asked him the next day if there was a way to stop her, to break the curse, but he didn't have an answer. "The river claims who it wants," he said. "There's no escaping it once she's marked you." But I wasn't ready to give up. There had to be something. A way to fight back. I spent hours poring over old books, researching everything I could about La Llorona and the legends surrounding her. The stories were all the same. Those who heard her cries were doomed, unable to escape her grasp. But in one of the oldest texts I found, there was a brief mention of something, a ritual that could, in theory, banish her spirit back to the depths of the river. It was risky, and there were no guarantees, but it was the only hope I had. The ritual required a place near the river where her presence was strongest, and several personal items from the person marked by her. In my case, that meant the clothes I had been wearing the first night I saw her. I also needed to gather offerings, small tokens that symbolized the life of those who had been taken by the river. Flowers, candles, and something that belonged to her victims. The last part was the hardest. I couldn't find anything from her past victims, at least not until I went back to the river at dawn, when the mist was still heavy and the air thick with silence. As I searched near the water, I found it. A small, weathered doll, half buried in the mud. Its eyes were cracked, and its dress was torn and soaked with river water, but it was unmistakable, a relic of one of the children La Llorona had claimed. With everything in place, I set out that night, my heart racing, knowing I had only one chance. The old man had warned me not to go back to the river, but I had no choice. I couldn't live like this, trapped, waiting for her to claim me. I had to try. The river was silent when I arrived, its waters eerily still. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground as I set up the ritual. I placed the flowers and candles in a circle, arranging the personal items in the center. The doll sat at the edge of the circle, its cracked eyes staring at me as if watching, waiting. I lit the candles and began to chant the words from the old text, my voice shaking as the wind picked up around me. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move, twisting and stretching toward me. I could feel her presence, the weight of her sorrow pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. Then, from the darkness, I heard it. Her sobbing. It started soft, barely audible, but quickly grew louder, more desperate. I kept chanting, my voice rising as the wind howled through the trees, whipping around me. The sobbing grew closer, and out of the corner of my eye I saw her, La Llorona, standing at the edge of the water, her long white dress billowing in the wind. Her eyes were locked on mine, and her mouth twisted into a scream that seemed to split the air. She stepped forward, her hands outstretched, reaching for me, and I felt the ground beneath me tremble as the river surged behind her. But I didn't stop. I kept chanting, the words spilling from my lips as fast as I could speak them. The candles flickered, nearly blowing out, but I shielded them with my hands, refusing to let the ritual fail. Her figure loomed closer, her sobs turning into shrieks of anger and pain. She was almost upon me when I reached the final words of the chant. I shouted them into the night, my voice barely audible over the howling wind and her piercing wail. For a moment, everything stopped. The wind, the river, her screams all fell silent. And then the ground beneath me gave way. I fell backward, landing hard on the muddy riverbank as the ground split open beneath La Llorona. She screamed again, her voice high and shrill, as the water surged up around her, pulling her back toward the river. Her hands clawed at the ground, trying to hold on, but the current was too strong. She was dragged into the water, her cries echoing in the night as her form disappeared beneath the surface. The river bubbled and churned, the water turning black and thick, before finally settling back into its calm, glassy state. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the sky, my body trembling. The ritual had worked. She was gone, or so I thought. In the days that followed, I waited for some sign, something to tell me it was over. And for a while, there was nothing, no sobbing, no whispers, no sightings of the woman in white. But then one night, just as I was falling asleep, I heard it again. A single sob, faint, distant, but unmistakable. La Llorona wasn't gone. She was still out there, still waiting. And I knew deep down that one day, she would come for me again.